Mossdale Caverns was considered a super severe cave. It was infamously Britain's most testing cave. More people have walked on the moon than have seen the far end of that cavern. And there's a reason for that. Because it was described as a death trap, a disaster waiting to happen, and a freak of nature. Most people had a healthy respect for the cave and refused to ever enter it. But for a group of 10 university students, the supposed danger and sense of doing the impossible was what drew them to the caves. And by the end of their final trip, that adventurous nature would trap some of them inside of the cavern forever. I'm Tatiana, and this is Occurrence. On June 24th, 1967, 10 young people from 3 caving clubs walked from the nearby village to assemble in front of Mossdale Cave. 2 of the cavers there had been inside of Mossdale before, 26-year-old Dave Adamson and 24-year-old Jeff Borio. Dave was the leader of the expedition, but both were from the University of Leeds Speleological Association, which I'm going to call ULSA from now on because that is a mouthful. Now, during this time period, university caving clubs were usually poked fun at by the more elite cavers and considered food for cave rescuers. But ULSA was different. They wanted to make a name for themselves and wanted to be taken seriously, so they made the goal of mapping Mossdale Caverns. Until ULSA, Mossdale Caverns was practically unmapped. The few that had been deep within Mossdale before were mostly happy to make it in and out alive. Because mapping caves is a very tiring and difficult job, but in Mossdale, the task was monstrous. And like I said before, very few people went into Mossdale. Most cavers, even the elite ones, refused to go inside. But since word traveled about what Dave was attempting to do, other cavers from different clubs wanted to join in on the exploration. Some even started to believe, with all of the repeated trips, that Mossdale might not be as dangerous as everyone was led to believe for all of these years. And that's how John Ogden, James Cunningham, and John Shepard, all 21 years old, and all from the Happy Wanderers Club, came to join the trip. Colette Lord tagged along with them too, and she was 19. She wasn't a caver, she just was out there for an unusual day out. There was also 23-year-old Colin Vickers and 19-year-old Bill Frakes from Bradford Pothole Club. They were both considered top cavers. Michael Ryan was there too, and he was 17 years old and considered a beginner with lots of potential. And last but not least, there was Morag Forbes, who was 22 years old, and she was engaged to Dave. They were planning to get married the following month. Dave and Geoff had been mapping the cave for a while now, and the goal for today was to blast and excavate the southern end of the high-level mud caverns. The others that were there would be bearers, and they were all eager to drag gear and add Mossdale to their list of adventures. Everyone was more than happy to be led by the man who knew the cave the best, and Dave swore he knew Mossdale better than anyone. The weather that day was okay. It was bright, but the forecast was a little sketchy. There was a chance of thundery showers. So 2 of the cavers from the Happy Wanderers Club, James and John, were nervous to go in because of the weather. The next week, they were supposed to join John and Bill to go help the British attempt to break the world depth record. All 4 of them were cave divers too. So while they're coming up with their excuses to get out of joining the trip this time, Dave told them he knew where they could stay safe. Because Dave started exploring Mossdale years ago, and it was all originally based off of Bob Leakey's sketches. Bob was the first person to explore Mossdale Cavern in 1941, and the only reason he entered Mossdale was because it was his way of curing his chronic claustrophobia. And side note, he also conquered his chronic aquaphobia by founding the British Sub-Aqua Club, if that doesn't tell you something about him. Bob was an aircraft designer, and during the Second World War, most cavers were at war, so he recruited unsuspecting aircraft factory girls to help him in his exploration. Most never helped him twice. So Bob pretty much solo explored Mossdale Caverns, which some say is comparable to reaching the South Pole. Repeated trips using basic equipment, candles, bike lamps, sleeping in mud-caked tiny flood-prone passages, wearing only a boiler suit. When he felt like there was nothing left to find, Bob never returned. He felt like he conquered his fear and had nothing left to prove. Some people called him crazy, though, because had anything gone wrong, no one would have been able to help him. Quite a few people doubted Bob's stories of Mossdale, and those same people also didn't want to test it. But under Bob's supervision, when he took on a couple of mentees in the following years, the cave was roughly surveyed to the sections named the Marathon and the Knee Wrecker. Further exploration was interrupted due to needing lower water conditions in order to use the wet lavatory basin entrance. So a new entrance was opened into Mossdale at the northern end that allowed people to enter and exit the cavern easier, even with high water conditions. For about 10 years after Bob's exploration of the cave, barely anybody attempted to enter it. Some of the crawl areas were filled with water, and some of the passages were so painful that it stopped most from even trying. But in 1957, ULSA was newly founded and would go to Mossdale with the goal of producing a detailed survey of the known passages and then tackle the offshoots of the cave. They were extremely methodical with it because they realized how lacking the rough surveys done before were. The problem now was the huge amount of men needed to survey the cave because it was so extensive and the ever-present flood risk. They believed there were some areas close to the entrance that wouldn't flood and maybe one or two far into the cave that would be safe too. In the early years, they installed a telephone line from the entrance to about 30 minutes into the cave, with constant communication happening with someone watching from outside. But eventually there was a stop to the cave activities, and the unfinished mapping of Mossdale was an unwavering annoyance to ULSA. There would be a few years of caving and a few years where no one was really interested. During those time periods, the telephone line had been repaired 3 times. The flooding constantly messed with it. And even though they talked about finding a way to get communication further into the caves, they never extended it past the section at the 30-minute mark. They said it was because of the huge amounts of time and manpower that the phone lines already installed took, and because it would be in the way inside of the smaller passages. They didn't revisit finding a way to extend communications after that. Then it was 1965, and a new wave of cavers emerged. This is when Dave showed up, and was just flying through surveying the cave with ULSA. They made a connection between the sections of the cave and proved and disproved other suspicions that they had. They forced their way through areas to connect to other areas. I mean, Dave was there for most of it, if not all of it, and he was comfortable. Over 7,600 feet of passages was surveyed, over 400 hours of caving time. Dave was there, and he was motivated to get through the area where he last stopped and see just how far and deep the cave went. And all of that was discovered in just 1 year. It was 5.5 miles of passages, and he just knew there were more. Since Dave had mapped a decent amount of Mossdale and believed he knew Mossdale better than almost anyone, he truly believed he identified places he didn't think would flood. So James and John, who didn't want to look like cowards, felt obligated to agree to go. But then Colette and Morag gave an excuse. The 2 girls weren't cavers, and they wanted an easy underground trip, so James and John volunteered to watch over them if Dave didn't need them for his trip. And so, at 2 p.m., the big group split at the cave entrance, with Dave and 5 others running off with the explosives, and Morag watched Dave disappear inside. John and James sat there teasing each other for using the girls as an excuse to chicken out. And then, for the next few hours, their group went on a sightseeing trip inside of Mossdale. Like I mentioned before, Mossdale Caverns is considered a geological freak of nature. That's because it's really 2 caves in one. There's Mossdale Scar, which is the limestone cavern, and then there's Mossdale Beck, which is a river-like stream that disappears into Mossdale Scar. The passages that are accessible go on for almost 7 miles and can get as small as just a few inches high. Most of the stream flowing into the cave vanishes into the rocks near the entrance and then reappears 5 miles away, 900 feet lower, and 18 days later in a pool called the Black Keld by the river wharf. The missing link of the unexplored cave between these 2 points is one of the deepest and longest in Britain, and it's what a lot of people try to find. It was around 5 p.m. when the group of 4 with the 2 girls came out of the cave. When they came out, they noticed light drops of rain, but nothing too concerning. They went back to their base hut to change and make a meal, and then James and John drove Colette back to Ingleton, while Morag stayed at the hut. Dave's group wasn't supposed to come back until after midnight, but at 7:30 p.m., Morag walked the 30-minute trip to check out Mossdale Scar, and there was barely a difference in the water level, so she went back to the hut. And just a little bit after she got back, the rain started pouring down. So she went back to check again, making it back to the entrance at 9 p.m., and was absolutely flabbergasted because a lake of swirling water covered the cave entrance. It was already completely underwater, so she immediately sprinted to a nearby farm for help, but nobody was there, so she had to run another 1.5 miles to find someone to drive her to call the rescue organizations. In total, it was almost 2 miles of her running. But it wouldn't be until 11:10 p.m. when the rescue got the call for assistance and sent help to Mossdale. When the advance team made it after 1 a.m., the entrance was under 4 feet of water, and they alerted ULSA and other clubs to what was going on so they could get out there to help too. One of the calls was to a caver in a pub where John and James, who had left earlier, were enjoying a drink. Both were completely unaware of the Mossdale storm, but both grabbed their gear and raced back to the cave. Cavers from all of the nearby towns descended onto Mossdale Cavern, and dozens of people, mostly using their bare hands, were digging a diversion ditch and building a dam. It was completely unstable, but later reinforced by thousands of sandbags. They tried to get a team inside of the cave, but they couldn't use dive equipment. But just beyond the entrance, where there's a limited air supply even when it's flooded, when they got inside, they realized that the rest of the way was completely submerged, so they were unable to continue. But eventually, a dozen portable pumps were pumping out water, and even though it stopped raining just after midnight, by 3:30 a.m., there was no effect on the water level. By 5 a.m., they decided to use heavy digging equipment to divert the river past the cave entrance. It was almost 130 yards long and about 8 feet deep. By 8 a.m. on Sunday, the water level had fallen a little, and the telephone connection was reestablished to just past the entrance. They could only get so far before deciding there was still too much water to safely continue, and felt that if the group did manage to find a passage with air, they were all experienced and well-equipped enough to wait out a flood 12 to 24 hours before making their way back out. By this point, some of the diggers believed hope might be lost, but all they could really do was wait for the water levels to fall more. Jim Eyre was one of the top cavers in Britain, and he had always said that he would never step foot inside of Mossdale. And in fact, just a week before this rescue, Dave asked him to join the expedition, and he turned it down. He was concerned with how nonchalant the younger cavers were when it came to Mossdale, but he was there that night, helping to dig the ditch and standing there waiting to lead the main team underground. The dam required constant repair, and cavers working the rescue in shifts would take turns passing out in the tents that they set up. It was then that Jim was able to lead his exhausted team down the still wet cave tunnels. Some of the trapped cavers' parents waited outside, desperate for news about their children. But part of Jim's mission was to establish a phone link to the original 30-minute point in the cave. Everyone inside of the cave now, going to rescue the trapped cavers, had never been inside of Mossdale before. It was a completely new and scary experience, but something everyone vividly remembered in the cave that day was Jim's humor. He tried to reassure everybody that soon they would hear their trapped friends coming, even though he didn't quite believe it himself. As they continued through the turns and squeezes of Mossdale Cavern, a couple of the rescuers thought they could hear distant echoing voices of their fellow friends. They thought they could hear footsteps splashing through the water or hushed whispers ahead of them. I wonder if they thought about how the 6 trapped in the tunnel had passed the different cave sections that they were in now, how they went through the knee-wrecker passage and through the 900-foot marathon crawl, where the only way through was by wiggling sideways in the water. Maybe they thought about how their fellow adventurers had hoped to find new passages, hours deep into the tunnel, and maybe reach the high caverns and were okay. Originally, the 6 cavers were probably having a good time, especially the ones that had been there before, probably teasing the ones who hadn't and were showing signs of hesitation. Then maybe one of them heard a noise, a rumbling sound. Someone would have asked what the sound was, and everyone would go quiet, just trying to listen. Maybe it was a slow rise of the water, or maybe it was a loud roar. But when they finally realized what it was, the stream rising, all of them can hear it now, and it's every caver's nightmare. Maybe they were calm because they're the country's best, and they felt invincible up to this point. Did they fully trust Dave to know where to go so they wouldn't drown, and they just calmly followed him? Or was it when they realized that the water was rushing in? Everyone panicked and was pushing and rushing to try to get to a nook or a cranny or a bigger opening where they could stand and have a better chance of survival. I guess we can never really know what happened in the caverns that day, but what we do know is when the rescuers made it to the far marathon, the 900-foot crawl where the tunnel was 10 inches high and 2 feet wide, it was abnormally dry. Realizing it was too tight for passing if they met with survivors, Jim sent a few men through, the ones frantic to see their friends again. But on their way through the long crawl, they ran into the first 2 bodies, jamming the passage. It was a shocking sight to stumble upon, but they had to crawl over them to find the rest. And as they continued on, they found 3 more. By the time Jim caught up with them in the tunnel, some were crying, and some were physically ill. One of the rescuers went up to Jim and said to go back, they're dead. So Jim called the rescuers outside of the tunnel asking for guidance, and told them that they found 5 bodies. Jim was told that there were actually 6, and then he was told to quickly get everyone out, because outside of the cave, the dam was trembling and had already collapsed twice. The cavers outside were forming human barriers in the stream to prevent a second disaster. So they left without finding the 6th man. Some still had hope that he may be alive. He could have been lost or unconscious or found a place in a high cavern. On Monday, the weather was bad, and hardly any searching was done. Efforts went to reinforcing the dam and making it as secure as possible. And with the telephone damaged again, a new telephone system was established that went even deeper into the cave. The following day, they had experienced cavers that had previously explored Mossdale with Ulsa to try and find the missing caver. There were multiple trips with different people in and out of Mossdale, and still no one could find him. At this point, Mossdale was international news. The circus outside of the cave, of sightseers and news camera crews, was overwhelming. Eventually, a doctor with the rescue organization took a trip inside of the cave and determined by signing a declaration that the missing caver had been flushed where he would never be found. But in a turn of events, one last attempt to find the 6th man was scheduled. At 10 p.m. on Tuesday night, Brian Boardman, a friend of the lost caver and an experienced rescue leader, guided 6 men on the last attempt to find him. And right past the 5 bodies that were discovered on the first rescue attempt, Brian spotted a gold ring. He moved around a little and saw a boot sticking out of a vertical fissure. It was such a small space that it looked impossible to get into. But somehow, missing caver, John Ogden, was so desperate to find just a little bit of air that he managed to wedge himself into it. He was covered in silt, and only his boots, socks, laces, and white helmet were visible. When Brian left the cave on Wednesday morning, the look on his face was so bleak that John's father, who hated John's caving activities and had been at the cave entrance for a few days waiting and hoping, he only needed to look at Brian's face once to know that it was over. And nobody knew what to do next because the rain was still falling and a lot of the rescuers left after hearing of John's fate. Reaching the bodies took 5 hours crawling, not to mention bringing them back out seemed impossible. So the cave was ordered to be permanently sealed and respected as a grave. It was a hard decision because most cavers object to block caves, especially ones that weren't fully explored. The inquest determined the tragedy to be due to misadventure. The following Sunday, a mini funeral service was held at the nearby church where hundreds of cavers packed the village. And even though the cave was sealed, in 1970, friends of victims managed to get into the cave and move the remains to a high-level cavern that they hoped would be high enough to avoid flooding. It was named the Sanctuary. I honestly feel for Morag, who lost her fiancé in this tragedy. I mean, can you imagine what she went through waiting? And for John's wife, because that ring spotted on his remains was new. He was newly married when this happened. Surprisingly, it's speculated that people still sneak into Mossdale today since you can still get inside. And there's allegedly a rumor that Ulsa is still determined to finish surveying the cave, and some of the students still sneak in. Of course, that's all alleged, it's a rumor, just wanted to mention it. Mossdale is the deadliest caving disaster in Britain's history, and honestly, not much changed after it happened, as far as future prevention and safety planning. If you think anything should be done or changed, be sure to let me know, either in the reviews or comments, depending on where you're listening at. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com. Stay safe, and see you next week.